The morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows of Riverside Global Headquarters, a skyscraper that seemed to pierce the clouds. Inside, the lobby buzzed with polished shoes clicking on marble floors, assistants juggling files, and executives speaking in clipped, hurried tones. The company pulsed with efficiency, its atmosphere one of power, wealth, and unrelenting ambition. But in the center of that vast empire, the man who owned it all looked defeated. CEO Alexander Grant, a man whose name alone made competitors tremble, stood in the middle of the corridor holding a little girl in his arms. His immaculate suit, worth more than most people's monthly salary, couldn't disguise the exhaustion etched on his face. His tie was slightly loosened, his sharp eyes dulled by sleepless nights. The girl, Lila, no older than 6, clung silently to his shoulder. Her small fingers gripped his lapel, but not a single word came from her lips. She hadn't spoken in months. The silence was not natural. Once, she had been full of laughter, her voice like tinkling bells echoing through the CEO's mansion. But after the accident, the car crash that took her mother's life, Lila had withdrawn into herself. Words that once came easily had vanished, swallowed by grief and fear. Doctors called it selective mutism brought on by trauma. Therapists and child specialists had tried session after session, coaxing her, bribing her with toys, games, and candy. Nothing worked. And for a man who could buy the best medical care in the world, that truth was unbearable. Alexander's employees noticed the change in him. He was still feared for his ruthless business decisions, still respected for his empire, but now, behind closed doors, his shoulders slumped when no one was watching. The indestructible man seemed cracked, worn down by the one battle he could not win, helping his daughter find her voice again. That morning, as he walked through the office halls with Lila in his arms, people tried not to stare. They lowered their heads in respect, but whispers followed him anyway. She still hasn't spoken, has she? All that money, and he can't help his own child. It's heartbreaking, she looks like a ghost of herself. Alexander heard every word, though no one dared say them directly to his face. He tightened his hold on Lila, whispering in her ear, his voice trembling though he tried to keep it steady. It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here. Daddy's here. You don't have to be afraid anymore. But Lila only stared ahead with wide, vacant eyes. Her lips pressed shut, as if invisible locks held them closed. The mighty CEO kept walking, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, but inside, he was breaking. His wealth, his power, his empire, none of it mattered if he couldn't hear the sound of his daughter's voice again. And though he didn't know it yet, help was coming from the most unexpected place in his entire empire, the man with a mop and bucket, the janitor. The night had settled over the city like a velvet curtain, blotting out the fiery sunset and replacing it with the soft glow of scattered lights. Most of the skyscraper's offices were dark now, their workers gone home to families, dinners, and lives outside the walls of Riverside Global. But on the top floor, one light still burned. Alexander Grant was still in his office, sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on a stack of reports that blurred together. His assistant had begged him to go home, but he refused. He always refused. Work was his shield, his way of keeping his mind occupied when the silence of his daughter's voice became too loud to bear. Lila sat quietly in the corner of the grand office, her small frame curled into a chair far too big for her. Her teddy bear lay limp in her lap, its button eye half hanging by a thread. She stared at it, rocking slightly, her lips sealed as always. The world outside that office never touched her, except that night, when someone else noticed. Down the hall, the faint squeak of wheels echoed. Samuel, the building's janitor, pushed along his mop bucket, whistling a tune under his breath. He was an older man, his back slightly bent, his uniform faded from years of scrubbing and polishing floors that others never noticed. To most executives, Samuel was invisible, just another fixture in the building, like the plants in the lobby or the paintings on the walls. But Samuel had a gift, he noticed the small things. That night, as he passed the open doorway of the CEO's office, he saw her. The little girl sitting all alone. Her shoulders drooped, her eyes hollow, her small lips pressed together as though she had forgotten what joy felt like. Samuel paused. His instincts told him not to intrude. After all, what business did a janitor have with the CEO's family? But then he glanced at the teddy bear in her hands, its loose button eye dangling. He remembered his own granddaughter, who used to hold her dolls the very same way when she was sad. His heart stirred. He looked down at the small wooden toy sticking out of his cart, something he had carved during his breaks, a little bird smoothed and polished by his calloused hands. He had planned to give it to his granddaughter, but maybe, just maybe, this girl needed it more. Slowly, cautiously, Samuel stepped into the doorway. He knelt down on one knee, careful not to frighten her, and held the toy bird out in his rough, work-worn palm. "Hey there, princess," he said gently, his voice low and warm. "I made this little fellow, but he's been awfully lonely. Think you could keep him company?" Lila blinked. Her eyes flicked to the toy bird, then back to the old man. For a moment, she didn't move. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Then, to Samuel's quiet amazement, her tiny hand reached out. She took the bird, turning it slowly in her fingers, studying the smooth wood, the way its wings seemed ready to lift off. And then, it happened. A flicker. A smile. Small, fleeting, but real. Her lips curved, just slightly, as if the toy bird had whispered a secret only she could hear. Samuel's chest tightened. He hadn't seen such a look in years, not since his granddaughter had grown too old for toys. He wanted to say more, but he knew better. Sometimes silence was stronger than words. From across the office, Alexander's phone call ended, and he stepped back into the room. His eyes immediately caught the sight, his daughter, smiling. Smiling at a janitor holding a mop. For a moment, the CEO froze. The sight stole his breath. He had hired the most expensive therapists in the country, yet none of them had coaxed a reaction from her. And here she was, smiling at a man who spent his nights scrubbing floors. His voice trembled as he spoke, eyes burning with sudden hope. "What did you do?" Samuel looked up, startled, but before he could answer, Alexander's desperation broke free. He clutched his daughter close, his voice raw. "If you can teach her to speak again, I'll give you everything I have." The words hung in the air like a vow, startling even Samuel. He didn't yet realize that his simple kindness had just opened the first crack in the wall around the little girl's heart. The words had slipped out of Alexander Grant's mouth before he could stop them. "If you can teach her to speak again, I'll give you everything I have." The office fell silent. Even the hum of the city below seemed to fade. Samuel, the janitor, still knelt on the carpet with the mop handle resting against his shoulder. He blinked at the CEO, unsure if he'd heard correctly. A man like Alexander Grant did not beg. He commanded, demanded, ordered, but never pleaded. And yet, here he was, his voice hoarse, his hands trembling as he held his daughter. Lila clutched the little wooden bird against her chest, her small fingers curling around it like it was something precious, almost sacred. The faint smile lingered on her face, fragile as glass. She still hadn't spoken, but that tiny expression of warmth had ignited a spark of wild hope inside her father. "Please," Alexander said again, softer this time, his eyes locking onto Samuel's. The desperation in them stripped away every layer of power, arrogance, and authority. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He wasn't a billionaire. He was just a father, broken and afraid. "I've tried everything, doctors, specialists, therapies. Nothing worked. But you," she smiled at you. She hasn't smiled in months. If you can bring her back to me, I'll pay you whatever you want. Money, a house, a business of your own. Anything. Just, give me my daughter's voice again." Samuel shifted uncomfortably. He had scrubbed these floors long enough to know how little men like Alexander usually saw him. Most executives never even looked him in the eye. And now, the most powerful man in the building was offering him the world. He let out a quiet sigh and stood, his knees aching from years of bending and climbing stairs. He placed a gentle hand over his mop, as though grounding himself, then shook his head. "I don't want your money, sir," he said simply. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man who had weathered life's storms without riches to shield him. Children don't need gold or mansions. They need time. Patience. Someone who listens. Alexander's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being refused. "You don't understand. I can give you more than you've ever dreamed of." But Samuel interrupted, not unkindly. "With respect, sir. I don't need dreams made of money. I just need you to trust me. That little girl doesn't need another doctor. She doesn't need more pressure. She needs to feel safe again. To believe that her voice matters. That's not something you can buy. It's something you give." For a long moment, the CEO said nothing. His chest rose and fell as if he were trying to contain years of pain, frustration, and helplessness. Around him, the office walls that once symbolized his power now felt like a prison. He was a man who owned skyscrapers, airlines, luxury hotels, and yet here he was, utterly powerless in front of his child's silence. Finally, his shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him, replaced with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, humility. He lowered his gaze. "Then, help her. Please. If it's patience she needs, if it's safety, show me how. Do whatever it takes. Just don't let her live in this silence forever." Samuel nodded once. He didn't promise miracles, only effort. He turned his gaze to little Lila, who was still studying the toy bird as though it carried secrets. Her lips pressed together, but her eyes were brighter now, less clouded with sorrow. Kneeling again, Samuel leaned closer to her and whispered softly, "We'll go slow, little one. No hurry. We'll start with a story, and maybe, one day, you'll tell me one back." Alexander watched, a lump forming in his throat. He had always believed power came from control, from dominance, from bending the world to his will. But here was a man who had none of those things, no money, no status, no influence, and yet he had managed to reach the one soul Alexander couldn't. And in that quiet moment, the mighty CEO understood, sometimes, the strongest hands are the gentlest. The next morning, the employees of Riverside Global noticed something unusual. Instead of arriving at dawn with his usual storm of assistants and briefcases, Alexander Grant walked in quietly, with his daughter by his side and, strangely, the janitor trailing a few steps behind. Whispers rippled through the lobby. "Why is the CEO with the janitor? Is that his daughter? What in the world is going on?" But Alexander didn't care. For the first time in months, he felt the faint flicker of hope. Samuel began his quiet work with Lila not in offices or therapy rooms, but in small, simple spaces. He asked Alexander to give them a corner of the company library, a cozy nook filled with sunlight, shelves of books, and carpet where she could sit comfortably. Every day, after school hours, Samuel met her there. He didn't push. He didn't demand. He simply was there. On the first day, he brought her another wooden toy, this time a tiny horse. He set it gently on the floor beside her, then pulled out a small harmonica from his pocket. The notes he played were soft, simple, almost clumsy, but they filled the silence like warm sunlight creeping into a dark room. At first, Lila only listened. Her big eyes followed the movement of his fingers, her head tilted slightly as though the music stirred something distant inside her. By the second week, she began to respond, not with words, but with gestures. Samuel would carve a toy bird, and she would flap her arms to mimic wings. He would hum a lullaby, and she would tap her teddy bear's paw to the rhythm. Slowly, piece by piece, the wall around her heart began to crack. Employees started to notice the changes too. Passing by the library window, they saw their CEO sitting on the floor in his crisp suit, watching in silence as his janitor whittled wood, told gentle stories, and made the little girl laugh. It was faint and breathless at first, but laughter nonetheless. Secretly, they stood at the glass, stunned. This wasn't the ruthless Alexander Grant they knew. This was a father, utterly devoted, his eyes soft as he watched his daughter's world open inch by inch. Some of the younger staff wiped away tears, whispering to each other. "She's healing. I can't believe it." Weeks turned into months. The routine became sacred, Samuel with his toys, songs, and stories, Lila with her hesitant smiles. Alexander with his patient presence, learning not to order or control but simply be there. One afternoon, Samuel spread a picture book across the carpet, a story of a little bird who had forgotten how to sing after a storm. He traced the drawings with his finger, narrating slowly. And then, Samuel said softly, looking at Lila, the bird remembered it didn't have to sing perfectly. It just had to try. A single note is enough to start a song. He tapped the toy bird she carried in her hands, carved long ago on that first night. Lila looked down at it. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came. Still, the effort itself made Alexander's heart race. He leaned forward, every muscle tense, hope surging through him. Samuel noticed and gave him a gentle look. "Don't rush her." So Alexander stayed quiet, swallowing his impatience, and simply held out his hand for Lila to take. She placed her tiny fingers into his, clutching the bird with her other hand. And though she didn't speak yet, her eyes shimmered with something different, a readiness, a desire. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He replayed the scene over and over, his daughter trying, almost speaking. It was more progress than all the expensive doctors had ever brought. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe, truly believe, that her voice would come back. He didn't know when, or how, but he knew this, with Samuel's patient guidance, it wasn't impossible anymore. And when it finally happened, it would change everything. It was a Friday evening. The skyscraper was nearly empty, the last of the employees heading home to families, while the golden sunset spilled through the tall windows and painted the halls in soft light. In the library corner, the now familiar trio sat together, Samuel with his harmonica and carving knife, Alexander on the carpet in his suit jacket loosened, and little Lila with her wooden bird tucked in her lap. They had been working with a new story that week, about a child who had lost her voice to a storm, only to discover it again when she whispered a single word to the sky. Samuel closed the book gently and smiled at Lila. "Well," he said, "our little bird found her song again. But I wonder," he tapped the wooden toy bird in her hands. "Do you think this one has a song too?" Lila stared at the toy. Her fingers trembled slightly as she rubbed its smooth wings. Her lips parted, then closed again. For weeks, she had come close. Too close. But tonight, something felt different. Alexander leaned forward, his breath caught in his chest. His heart pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stay silent, remembering Samuel's warning, "Don't push. Don't rush her." The room felt heavy with anticipation, as if the entire building was holding its breath. And then, like a tiny miracle breaking through, Lila whispered. "Pa." The sound was so faint that at first Alexander thought he had imagined it. His eyes widened. He looked at Samuel, who had frozen mid-breath, tears already shining in his old eyes. Then it came again. Stronger. Clearer. "Papa." Alexander's world shattered, and rebuilt itself, in a single heartbeat. The word he had longed for, prayed for, begged the universe for, had finally broken through the silence. His daughter's voice. Fragile, trembling, but alive. He dropped to his knees in front of her, pulling her into his arms. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks, unchecked and unashamed. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm here. Papa's here. Always." His voice cracked, his body shaking as he held her tighter than ever before. Lila pressed her face into his chest, clutching the toy bird between them. Her small voice whispered again, muffled but real. "Papa." It was as if the word itself had unlocked the dam inside Alexander's soul. He sobbed, not like the ruthless CEO the world knew, but like a broken man finally made whole. Behind him, Samuel looked away, giving father and daughter their moment. His gnarled hands tightened around the handle of his mop. He had seen many things in his long life, but this was the kind of miracle only love and patience could bring. When Alexander finally looked up at him, his face streaked with tears, his voice was hoarse with gratitude. "Samuel. I can never repay you. I promised you everything I have, and I meant it. Name it. Money, houses, businesses, anything. It's yours." But Samuel shook his head gently, his kind eyes shining. "I don't need riches, sir. I've already been given everything tonight." He nodded toward the little girl resting in her father's arms. She didn't need wealth. She needed someone to believe in her. That's all. Alexander's throat tightened. For a man who had built an empire, those words cut deeper than any business lesson he had ever learned. He crossed the room, reached out, and embraced Samuel. Not as a CEO thanking an employee, but as a father thanking the man who had saved his daughter. And in that embrace, Alexander understood the truth he had overlooked all his life. True treasure isn't found in vaults or bank accounts. It's found in the fragile voice of a child saying, "Papa."